The wind carried dust across the open plains, curling it in little spirals before it settled again into the parched earth. The faint rhythm of hooves echoed in the silence. Steady, deliberate. A lone rider approached from the horizon, his figure dark against the backdrop of a setting sun. He sat tall in the saddle, but time had weighed heavy on his shoulders. His broad-brimmed hat shaded most of his face, yet the shadow could not conceal the hardness in his eyes, nor the deep lines carved there by grief, dust, and years of wandering. The horse beneath him was a lean bay, muscles taut and swift. From the long trail, every step seemed to carry not only the rider, but also the heavy silence of unspoken memories. Dangling from the saddle, a rifle gleamed faintly, and at his hip rested a well-worn Colt revolver, the only companions who had never betrayed him. Ahead lay the town of Red Rock, a place that once had been his home, his sanctuary, his pride. But as he rode closer, it was clear that time had not been kind. The paint on the buildings peeled, the saloon's swinging doors creaked in the dry wind, and the once bustling Main Street now looked tired and subdued. Folks moved slower, eyes low, voices hushed, as if the town itself was under a shadow. Ryder stopped at the edge of town, his eyes scanning every corner, every rooftop, every alley. The memories returned unbidden. He had left this place with fire licking the night sky behind him, his ranch reduced to embers, his wife's screams cut short by gunfire, his child's small voice silenced forever. He'd ridden away then, broken and half-dead, promising himself he would return not for redemption, not for peace, but for vengeance. And now here he was, as he nudged his horse forward. The sound of hooves striking the wooden planks of the main street drew every gaze. Townsfolk paused in their workshop, keepers leaning against doorframes, women clutching baskets, children peeking curiously from behind skirts. Whispers rippled across the street like the rustle of dry leaves. It's him, thought he, was dead, back after all these years. Their voices carried fear and awe, for this was no ordinary man returning. This was a rancher who had once stood tall in this town, who had lost everything to greed and cruelty, and who had vanished into the wilderness with nothing but his horse and his gun. His return meant only one thing: blood would soon be spilled. He dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the dust with a thud that seemed louder than it should have been. For a long moment, he stood still, his hand brushing the horse's mane, his gaze locked on the saloon at the center of town. Behind those swinging doors lay whiskey, cards, and men who worked for the one he had come for, the cattle baron who had taken his life apart piece by piece. The blacksmith, an old friend with soot-streaked hands, stepped out of his shop, his eyes widening. "By God," he whispered, his voice trembling with something between relief and dread. "You really came back." The rancher's eyes flickered toward him, but he said nothing. Words were too small for what burned inside him. Instead, he adjusted his hat, squaring it against the dying sun, and walked forward with a stride that carried both exhaustion and determination. The sheriff appeared next. Standing at the far end of the street, his badge caught a glint of light, but his eyes did not shine. They were wary, tired, afraid. He knew as well as anyone what the rancher's return meant: trouble, gunfire, blood in the dust. The sheriff's hand hovered near his holster, but he didn't draw, not yet. The town seemed to hold its breath as the rancher passed. Each step he took stirred up dust, and each face that turned toward him carried a different story: fear, hope, pity, or quiet anticipation. Finally, he stopped outside the saloon, the wooden sign above it swinging in the hot breeze. He looked up, then pushed the doors open. The murmur of voices inside died instantly. Poker hands froze mid-play. Whiskey glasses hovered halfway to lips, and the piano man stopped with his fingers suspended above the keys. The rancher's boots echoed on the saloon floor as he walked in. All eyes followed him, but his gaze was fixed on the bar, where a burly man stood polishing a glass. The rancher set his hat on the counter, his voice low, gravelly, and filled with the weight of years. "Whiskey," he said. The glass was poured. He took it, downed it in one swallow, and set it back with a firm clink. Then, turning just enough for everyone to hear, he spoke the words that would seal his purpose. "I came back," he said, his voice steady, "to settle what should have been settled a long time ago." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, as if the town itself knew a storm had just rolled in. The rancher placed his hat back on his head, tipped it low, and walked out into the dying light. The score was waiting, and this time he wouldn't stop until it was paid in full. The rancher's return to Red Rock wasn't just a homecoming, it was stepping back into the ashes of his past. Every dusty storefront, every hitching post, every set of eyes watching him carried echoes of what he had lost. The townsfolk didn't whisper openly, but their glances said enough. That's him, the one whose life was burned to cinders. But the story of his past wasn't something whispered in saloons. It was seared into his bones, branded in his heart. It was a wound that had never healed, only hardened. The ranch before the fall years ago. Before the fire, the rancher had everything a man could want. His land spread wide under the Arizona sky, rolling pastures, a barn strong enough to weather storms, and cattle enough to make a living. He worked that land with calloused hands and an honest back, building fence lines by day, mending saddles by lantern light at night. But what made it more than land, more than work, was the family he had built there. Martha, his wife, had been his anchor. She was no delicate flower. She was tough, sharp-eyed, and unyielding when it came to protecting what was theirs. She laughed easily, sang while she worked, and turned the rough edges of his life into something warm. And then there was Jacob, their boy, barely 8 years old, but already bold. Wild hair, bright eyes, always running, always asking questions about the world. He was a piece of the rancher's soul, walking on 2 small legs. For a while, the rancher believed fate had finally given him peace. The shadow of greed, but peace doesn't last long in a land where power speaks louder than honesty. Ezekiel Crane was the kind of man who believed everything had a price. He already owned half the cattle in the county and wanted the other half. He came to the rancher one evening, his hat tipped low, his men behind him, and offered to buy the land. "This land isn't for sale," the rancher had said. Standing on his own porch with Martha at his side, Crane had smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile a man wears when he's amused. It was the sharp grin of a predator. Everything's for sale. Some things just cost more than others. The rancher had felt the threat in those words, but he refused to bend. His pride was his strengthened in the end. His downfall. The night that broke him, it was a summer night. When Crane made his move, the air was dry, brittle with heat. The rancher had been out mending fences when he smelled smoke on the wind. At first, he thought it was a neighbor burning brush. Then he saw the glowing wild, too big for a brush fire. His heart stopped. He kicked his horse into a dead run, flying across the fields. By the time he reached the house, flames were roaring through the roof. The barn was already gone. The fields lit with sparks. He heard Martha scream. He heard Jacob cry out. He ran for the door, but 2 of Crane's men stepped from the shadows, revolvers drawn. Mio should have sold. One of them sneered. The rancher drew for his Colt, but a shot rang out first. The bullet ripped into his shoulder, sending him sprawling into the dirt. He clawed at the ground, desperate to rise, desperate to get inside, but the men pinned him down, laughing coldly as the fire consumed everything he loved. Through the flames, he saw Martha clutching Jacob, her figure silhouetted in the blaze. He screamed her name, but the roof collapsed before his eyes. The sound of Jacob's cry cut off. Smothered by fire and smoke, the world ended in that moment. The men spat in the dirt, mounted their horses, and rode off into the night, leaving him broken. Their words lingered like poison. Remember this. This is what happens when you cross Ezekiel Crane. Ashes and exile by dawn. There was nothing left. Only blackened beams, smoking earth, and silence. The rancher, half dead from blood loss and grief, mounted his horse and rode away. Not because he wanted to live, he had no reason to, but because death refused him. He wandered for years. Across deserts, mountains, and border towns. He worked cattle drives, laid railroad ties, even spent time with outlaws. He hardened his body, sharpened his skills with a gun, and learned the patience of a man who has nothing left but time. Every night, he dreamed of fire, of his boy's voice, of Martha's scream, and every morning, he awoke with one purpose, one vow. One day, I'll ride back. One day, I'll settle the score. Now, standing again in Red Rock, the vow burned hotter than ever. The past was not behind him, it was right here, breathing in his ear, daring him to act. And the man who had destroyed everything was still alive, not for long. The rancher knew he couldn't simply draw his gun and face Ezekiel Crane in the open, not yet. Red Rock had changed since the day he left, and Crane's grip on the town was stronger than the iron rails running through its heart. If the rancher wanted revenge, he had to understand the battlefield first. A town in chains. Red Rock used to be a small but proud settlement, filled with ranchers, merchants, and families carving a life out of the dust. Now it wore Crane's brand as surely as his cattle bore the hot iron. The saloon, once a place for cowhands to sing and gamble, was now his den. Every bottle poured, and every hand of cards dealt brought profit to Crane's pockets. The sheriff's office sat at the edge of town, but its badge no longer meant justice. Sheriff Harlan, a weary, heavy-set man, owed his job to Crane. Folks whispered that Harlan looked the other way when Crane's men beat a farmer or confiscated a stray calf. Law in Red Rock wasn't measured by right or wrong, but by Crane's word. The rancher walked through the town square with his hat pulled low, noting each detail, each change. The blacksmith's forge was quieter than he remembered, business drying up after Crane forced most ranchers to sell out. A general store once run by a friendly couple now sat under the shadow of Crane's enforcers. One lounged by the door, shotgun resting on his knees, daring anyone to cross him. The town wasn't free, it was occupied. The saloon encounter that evening, the rancher stepped into the saloon. The room fell quiet for a beat, as strangers always do when a man enters with the weight of purpose in his stride. He ordered a whiskey, but his eyes weren't on the glass. They swept the room. Crane wasn't there, but his men were. Half a dozen of them sat at tables, loud and laughing, guns hanging at their sides. They drank with the smugness of men who believed themselves untouchable. One of them, a tall brute with a scar cutting across his cheek, eyed the rancher. "You new around here, cowboy?" he asked, voice carrying over the piano's tune. The rancher sipped his drink, set the glass down slowly, and met the man's stare. "Just passing through." The brute smirked. "Passing throughs, dangerous lot of bad men around here." His friends chuckled. The rancher didn't rise to the bait. Not yet. He simply tipped his hat and turned his gaze back to the bar. That quiet, measured defiance was enough to sour their amusement. The scar-faced man muttered something, but didn't push further. Still, the rancher knew one thing: no Crane's men noticed him. His shadow was no longer invisible. Allies in the dust. Not everyone in Red Rock had bowed to Crane. The rancher found that out the next morning as he watered his horse outside the livery. A young boy approached, barely a teenager, freckled face, wide eyes. "You're him, ain't you?" the boy whispered. The rancher frowned. "Who's askin'?" The boy looked around nervously. "Name's Samuel. My pa used to know you. He said you fought Crane once, long ago. Folks here still talk about it. They say you're the only man ever stood up to him." The rancher studied the boy. Behind Samuel, a woman emerged from a nearby doorway, his mother. She carried herself with the weary strength of someone who had survived too much. She gave the rancher a long look, then nodded slightly, almost like permission. That night, they shared their story. Samuel's father had refused to sell his small plot of land to Crane. One morning, he'd been found dead on the roadside, killed in a fall, they said. Everyone knew better. Now his widow struggled to keep her home, raising Samuel alone, living under the weight of Crane's threats. The rancher listened silently, the fire in his chest rekindling. He wasn't alone in his hate. The whole town lived under Crane's boot, but most were too afraid to fight back. If he struck at Crane, he wouldn't just be fighting for himself, he'd be fighting for them, too. The weight of vengeance as night fell again. The rancher stood on the outskirts of town, looking at the distant hills where Crane's grand ranch loomed like a fortress. Torches burned outside, guards patrolled the fences, and the sound of cattle echoed across the plain. The man clenched his fists. He had spent years sharpening his skill, surviving on anger alone. But vengeance wasn't simple anymore. It wasn't only about Martha and Jacob, it was about everyone Crane had crushed since that night, and vengeance demanded patience. For now, he would watch. He would learn Crane's patterns, his men's weaknesses. When the time came, his gun and his horse would deliver justice. The rancher's eyes narrowed, his vow whispering through the dark. "Crane took everything from me. Now, I'll take everything from him." The rancher spent his first few days in Red Rock, moving like a shadow, quiet, unnoticed when he wanted, but always watching. He was learning who had bent their knee to Ezekiel Crane and who still held on to their dignity. In a place like this, knowing a man's loyalties could mean the difference between life and death. The blacksmith's forge's first stop was the forge, tucked near the edge of town. The hammer rang against steel as he pushed the door open, the smell of hot iron and ash flooding his senses. Behind the anvil stood Thomas Health, a blacksmith. Time had grayed his beard and thickened his frame. But when he lifted his head and caught sight of the rancher, his hammer froze midair. "By God," Thomas muttered, his voice rough but warm. "I thought you were buried under that prairie years ago." The rancher's mouth twitched into something close to a smile. "Not yet." Thomas set his hammer down and gripped the rancher's arm, pulling him into a hard, brotherly embrace. For a moment, the years and blood between them vanished. They'd ridden together once, young men with calloused hands and wild dreams. Before Crane's men tore everything apart. "You shouldn't have come back," Thomas said quietly, eyes flicking to the door as though expecting Crane's spies to be listening. "The man who owns this town doesn't forgive ghosts rising from their graves. That's why I came back," the rancher answered. Thomas studied him, then sighed. "Then you'll be needing iron." The rancher laid his rifle on the table, worn but reliable. Thomas ran his fingers over the barrel, nodding slowly. "I can fix her up, but it'll take time. You've still got the hands for killing." The rancher's blue eyes darkened. "I've still got the reasons." The widow's faith. Evening, the rancher walked the quiet road beyond the church, where lantern light glowed through the window of a small farmhouse. It belonged to Mary Collins, the widow he'd once helped years ago when her roof was torn off by a storm. She had been younger then, with laughter in her eyes. Now she carried sorrow like a shawl draped over her shoulders. Worn but steady. She opened the door when he knocked, her face pale with shock. "It's you," she whispered, her hand rising to her lips. He nodded. "It's me." Tears welled in her eyes, though she quickly blinked them away. "I prayed you'd come back. Not just for me, for this town. Crane's been bleeding us. Dry folks are too scared to lift their heads." The rancher shifted his hat in his hands. "Scared men stay slaves. You don't have to." She shook her head. "It's not that simple. He's got the sheriff, the deputies, half the businesses in his pocket. People who resist vanish. People who speak up die." Her voice broke, and he knew the cost of her words. She'd lost someone to Crane's cruelty. Maybe a brother, maybe a father. He didn't press. Then it ends, the rancher said firmly. That's why I'm here. Mary's eyes searched his face, desperate for hope. Alone, you can't win. He thought of the rifle at the forge, of Thomas's grip on his arm, and of the whispers already stirring in town. Maybe not, but a fire starts small, and it spreads. Shadows of betrayal, but not everyone welcomed his return. At the saloon that night, the rancher felt eyes on his back the moment he stepped through the doors. Crane's men sat at the tables, loud with drink, laughing at crude jokes. One of them, a thin fellow, with a scar across his cheek, stood up when he spotted him. Well, the man sneered. Look who the dust blew in. Thought Crane finished you off. The saloon went quiet. The piano stopped mid-note. The rancher's voice was calm, flat. Guess he didn't try hard enough. The man spat tobacco juice into the corner. You should have stayed dead. Folks around here don't want trouble. The rancher stepped closer, his spurs ringing against the wooden floor. Then maybe they shouldn't follow a man who brings it. The scarred man's hand twitched toward his holster, but the rancher's iron was already free, leveled steady at his chest. Silence thickened, every breath in the saloon held tight. Not tonight, the rancher said coldly. Go tell your boss I'm here. Tell him I'm not leaving. The man swallowed hard, his bravado cracking, and lowered his hand. Muttering curses, he backed away. The rancher holstered his gun. But the message was clear. Crane's men knew he was back, and soon Crane himself would know two old friends. New enemies that night. The rancher stood outside the saloon, under the starry sky, lighting a cigarette. He had allies now, a blacksmith who still believed in him, a widow who still had faith. But he also had enemies watching from every dark corner. He exhaled smoke and muttered to himself. The board set, and he knew before long, blood would spill. The news traveled faster than wildfire in dry grass. By morning, everyone in Red Rock knew the rancher had returned. By noon, the story reached Ezekiel Crane himself. Crane wasn't a man who ignored whispers. He made his empire by striking first, striking hard, and making sure fear spread deeper than loyalty ever could. So, when one of his men, Scar, the thin-faced thug from the saloon, stumbled into Crane's office, breathless with tales of the rancher's return, Crane's reaction wasn't anger. It was a smile. Alive, Crane mused, leaning back in his leather chair. His office was a strange mix of wealth and menace. Polished wood desk, velvet curtains, silver revolvers, displayed like trophies, and a whip coiled neatly by the wall. I buried that ghost myself, or so I thought. Scar rubbed the scar across his cheek nervously. He's back, boss. Walked into the saloon like he owned the place. Drew on me before I could blink. He's fast, real fast. Crane's smile vanished. He rose from his chair, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator. Then let's remind him whose land he rides on. He wants a fight. We'll send him a warning. The messenger that evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, the rancher stood near Thomas's forge, watching sparks leap into the air. His rifle was propped against the workbench, the barrel gleaming after the blacksmith's careful polish. You're staring hornets, Thomas muttered, pounding iron against the anvil. Words out. Crane won't sit quiet. The rancher said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was the kind that made men nervous, heavy with promises unspoken. That's when hooves thundered outside, cutting through the clang of steel. A rider appeared, tall and broad, carrying Crane's black flag tied to his saddle. The horse snorted, restless, as if it too sensed the tension. The rider dismounted, boots crunching against the dirt, and tossed a rolled parchment at the rancher's feet. Message from Crane. The rancher bent, picked it up, and unrolled. It, scrawled in bold strokes of ink, were the words, "Leave by sunrise, or Red Rock will burn." The rider smirked. Boss says, you've got no business here. He's being generous, giving you a chance to walk out alive. The rancher's jaw tightened. He rolled the parchment back up, tossed it into the forge, and watched it curl into ash. Tell your boss. His voice was low, steady. Don't scare. The rider's grin faltered, but he forced a laugh. Then you'll die. He mounted up and rode off, dust swirling in his wake. Thomas let out a long breath. You just signed this whole town's death warrant. The rancher finally turned to him, eyes like flint. No. Crane did that a long time ago. I'm just here to end it. Fear in the streets. Word of Crane's warning spread fast. By nightfall, townsfolk gathered in whispers near the saloon, the church, the mercantile. Mothers pulled their children indoors. Shutters slammed. Lamps went dark. Fear clung to Red Rock like a storm cloud. Mary Collins found the rancher standing outside the church, his figure outlined by moonlight. She grabbed his arm, desperation in her eyes. You can't fight Crane head-on, she pleaded. He'll destroy everything to prove a point. He's done it before, burned out farms, hung men in the square. The rancher's expression softened, but only slightly. That's why he has to be stopped. Mary shook her head. People don't need more blood. They need hope. Hope don't come cheap, he replied. Her lips trembled as though she wanted to argue, but no words came. She only whispered, don't let him take the rest of us. Then she turned away, clutching her shawl tighter against the night chill. Crane's shadow across town. Ezekiel Crane stood on his balcony, overlooking Red Rock. Lanterns glowed faint in the streets below, flickering like dying stars. He sipped whiskey from a glass rimmed with gold, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "He won't leave," Scar said from behind him. "I seen it in his eyes." Crane's lips curved into a cold smile. "Good. Then the game begins." He lifted his glass toward the town, as though toasting its fate. "By the time I'm through, Red Rock will remember the cost of defiance, and he'll learn." His voice dropped into a growl. "That ghosts don't come back without a grave waiting for them." The night wind howled through the canyon, carrying with it the promise of war. Closing. Beat the rancher saddled his horse under the stars, the rifle strapped across his back. He could feel the weight of Crane's warning pressing on him, the fear soaking into Red Rock. But fear didn't move him. Vengeance did. Justice did. He whispered to the horse, voice low and calm. "Tomorrow, we start settling scores." And with that, he rode into the darkness, ready for whatever storm Ezekiel Crane would send. The first strike didn't come at sunrise, as Crane's message promised. It came in the deep hours of night, when the town slept under a blanket of uneasy silence. The rancher had been expecting it. He lay awake on the floor of the small cabin. Thomas loaned him his rifle within arm's reach. Years of war and betrayal had sharpened his instincts. He could feel violence in the air long before it arrived. And tonight, the air was heavy. Sparks in the dark. It began with the smell. Smoke, faint at first, carried on the wind. Then shouts muffled, frantic. The rancher was on his feet in a heartbeat, boots sliding on the rough wood floor. He snatched up his rifle, threw open the door, and stepped into chaos. 2 barns on the edge of town were ablaze, flames clawing at the night sky. Horses screamed inside their pens. Townsfolk rushed with buckets, and children cried as the fire spread. The orange glow lit up the dark like a second sun. And through the smoke, riders appeared. Crane's men. 6 of them, masked and armed, galloping hard through the streets. Their pistols barked fire, bullets snapping wood and glass. One tossed a torch onto a roof, and within moments, the shingles caught. It wasn't just a fire, it was a message. The rancher responds. The rancher didn't hesitate. He dropped to one knee beside a water trough, bracing his rifle against the wood. His breath slowed, his finger curled steady on the trigger. Crack. The first rider pitched backward, torch tumbling from his hand before it hit the ground. Crack. Another fell, his pistol spinning from his fingers as his horse bolted. The rest scattered. Surprised by the ghost who had risen from his grave, they fired wildly, their bullets sparking off the iron pump beside the trough. The rancher shifted positions, always moving, never lingering. He was one man, but the echo of his shots rolled like thunder, making him sound like a small army. Thomas emerged from his forge swinging a hammer, bellowing curses as he cracked it across the jaw of a rider who got too close. The townsfolk, frightened but desperate, joined the fight, throwing stones, pulling riders down, beating them with whatever they could grab. The ambush had turned into a skirmish, smoke and ashes by the time the last rider fled. 2 barns and 1 house were reduced to skeletons of fire. The town smelled of smoke and blood. A young boy sobbed beside his dead father, shot during the raid. A woman knelt in the dirt, clutching her burned hands from trying to pull her animals out of the barn. The rancher stood in the middle of it all, rifle still warm in his hands. His face was carved in stone, but his eyes burned like the fire around him. This wasn't just about him anymore. Crane hadn't just sent a warning, he had declared war on the entire town, and war was something the rancher knew better than most. A choice for Red Rock as dawn broke. The people of Red Rock gathered in the square. Ash drifted in the breeze, coating their clothes and skin in gray. Mary Collins stood at the front, her face pale but her voice steady. "We can't stand alone. If we don't fight back, Crane will burn everything we love. But if we do fight, more of us will die. This is the choice he's left us." The townsfolk murmured, torn between fear and fury. All eyes eventually drifted to the rancher. He stepped forward, shoulders broad, rifle resting across his chest. "Crane's already decided your fate," he said, his voice low, steady. "But I've lived under his shadow. I've seen what he does to those who bow. He won't stop until every one of you is broken or buried." He paused, letting his words sink deep. "Then, I ain't asking you to fight my fight, but I'll be damned if I let him take this town without standing in his way. With or without you, I'm settling this score." A hush fell. Then Thomas stepped up beside him, hammer still stained with blood. "With you," he growled. One by one, others joined, a farmer, a shopkeeper, even the preacher, holding nothing but a walking stick, nodded his head. The line had been drawn. Red Rock would no longer cower. Closing beat far off on the ridge. A single rider watched the scene unfold. He turned his horse and galloped back toward Crane's compound. The message was clear. The rancher wasn't leaving. And now, Red Rock stood with him. By the time the rider returned to Crane, the war for Red Rock had officially begun. The sun rose slow and red, staining the horizon like blood. Smoke still lingered over Red Rock. curling above the charred remains of the barns and blackened timbers of the Collins roof. The townsfolk worked in silence, repairing what they could, burying what they couldn't, but under the exhaustion, something else stirred: defiance. For years, Crane had ruled with fear. No one dared to raise a hand, no one dared to say his name above a whisper. But now, with the rancher walking among them scarred, steady, unshakable, they had seen proof that Crane's men could bleed. And Crane knew it. Crane strikes back too. Days after the raid, a rider galloped into town, horse lathered with sweat. He carried no gun, only a message scrawled in rough, heavy letters. Leave the rancher to us, and the rest of you live. Defy me, and Red Rock dies. Samuel Crane. The paper was nailed to the post in the square for all to see. Men muttered. Women clutched their children closer. Fear crept back like a shadow, but the rancher only spat in the dust. Crane, don't give mercy, he said flatly. He's just buying time to set the noose tighter. His words proved true before nightfall. Riders. At the edge, the sound came first: hoofbeats, dozens of them, rolling like thunder. Then the figures appeared on the ridge beyond town. Riders in dark coats, rifles strapped to their saddles. Crane's men, but they didn't charge. They simply sat there, a line of silhouettes against the dying light, watching, waiting. The rancher studied them from the street, jaw clenched. He's hemming us in, he muttered. Not a raid, a siege. Sure enough, by morning, Crane's riders had spread. They camped in the hills, cutting off every trail in or out of Red Rock. No wagons could pass. No messages could be sent. The town was trapped. Red Rock prepares. Panic rippled through the townsfolk. Food was scarce already. With the roads blocked, it would only grow worse. Some whispered about turning the rancher over, letting Crane have his vengeance so the rest could live. The rancher heard the whispers but said nothing. Instead, he worked. He taught Thomas how to rig barricades from wagons and scrap iron. He showed the blacksmith how to forge spikes from old nails. Scattered at crossroads to cripple horse hooves. He drilled the farmers with their shotguns, teaching them to aim slow, breathe steady, squeeze not, jerk the trigger. Mary organized the women into lookouts, stationing them in church towers and rooftops with lanterns to signal danger. Even the children carried buckets of water, ready to douse sparks should fire rain down again. For the first time, Red Rock wasn't just surviving, it was preparing to fight. Crane's move, but Crane was not idle. From his ranch fortress, he watched the town tighten its defenses and sneered. Let them build their little walls, he told his lieutenants. We'll grind them down, one nail at a time. He sent riders at night to torch fields, poison wells, and pick off anyone who strayed too far. He wanted to starve Red Rock into breaking before he delivered the killing blow. Every loss was a knife in the townsfolk's hearts. Every funeral made the whispers louder. Give him the rancher. Save yourselves. And yet, the rancher stood firm. His calm was unshakable, his presence like bedrock. Crane wants you scared, he told them. Fear's how he wins. But fear don't put food in his belly, and fear don't stop bullets. We can bleed him out, same way he's trying to bleed us. A night of blood. One night, under a silver moon, Crane made his first real strike. A dozen riders charged in from the north, shooting wildly, hoping to test Red Rock's defenses. But the rancher was waiting. He lay hidden behind an overturned wagon, rifle braced, eyes sharp. When the riders galloped into range, he let loose. The first man fell. Then the second. Thomas and the others fired from windows and rooftops, lantern signals flashing across the streets. The townsfolk held the line. When the smoke cleared, 4 of Crane's men lay dead in the dirt. The rest retreated, dragging their wounded into the dark. Red Rock had won the first round. Closing beat, but victory came at a cost. 2 young boys, barely 16, lay dead where stray bullets had found them. Their mothers wailed in the square as the fires from the raid still smoldered. The rancher stood apart, rifle in hand, gaze fixed on the hills. He knew Crane wasn't beaten. The siege had only just begun. And before it ended, Red Rock would pay. In blood, the days dragged on like weeks. Red Rock stood, but the noose around its neck grew tighter with each sunrise. Crane's men still circled the hills, their campfires burning at night like devil eyes on the ridges. Supply wagons never came. Fields beyond the town smoldered in ruin, and wells had been fouled with carcasses. Hunger gnawed at every stomach, and fear gnawed at every soul. The townsfolk tried to keep busy fortifying barricades, drilling with their weapons, carrying water, tending to the wounded, but despair was a sickness, and it spread quickly. It was in this fragile state that betrayal took root. Whispers in the dark at first. It was just whispers. A few men muttering in the saloon after dusk. We wouldn't be in this mess if not for him. The rancher brought this fight to us. Crane don't care about Red Rock, just about settling with him. The rancher heard the rumors, but he never answered them. He knew fear made people dangerous, and desperation made them foolish. But not all whispers were harmless. A man named Carter, one of the ranch hands from the burned-out Collins place, had grown bitter. He'd lost 2 brothers in the raid, And though he had fought bravely that night, grief twisted into hatred not for Crane, but for the man who stood against him. Crane just wants the rancher, Carter said, louder each day. Turn him over, and the rest of us live. Some listened. Too many. Mary's warning. Mary Collins was the first to hear of Carter's scheming. She brought it straight to the rancher. They're thinking of handing you over, she said, voice taut with worry. Carter's stirring him up, says you're dragging us all into your personal war. The rancher's jaw tightened. He had expected Crane's bullets. He hadn't expected the knife of betrayal from inside. I didn't ask for this town's blood, he said quietly, but Crane don't stop if they hand me over. He'll break Red Rock same as he's broke every man who crossed him. Mary nodded, her eyes fierce. Then you better make him believe it, before Carter does worse. A plan in the shadows that night. As the rancher patrolled the barricades, he noticed Carter slip away into the dark. No rifle in hand, no guard duty assigned. Just a man heading toward the hills where Crane's riders camped. The rancher followed, silent as the desert wind. Sure enough, Carter carried more than his grief. He carried a scrap of paper and a lantern. When he reached the ridge, he lit the lantern and swung it 3 times. A signal. Within minutes, a rider emerged from the shadows. One of Crane's lieutenants. The 2 men spoke in low tones. The rancher didn't need to hear the words. He saw enough: the handshake, the exchange of coin, the betrayal sealed under moonlight. Carter was feeding Crane information. Confrontation by dawn. Carter was back in town, walking bold as brass. But when he entered the saloon, he found the rancher waiting. The room froze as the rancher's voice cut through the smoke. You meet a friend last night, Carter. Carter stiffened. What are you getting at? I saw you, the rancher said flatly. Saw you shaking hands with Crane's dogs. The room erupted, shouts, curses, men rising from their chairs. Carter's face twisted with desperation. You think this is my fault? He spat. My brothers are dead 'cause of you. If handing you over saves the rest of us, then I'll do it myself. He went for his pistol, but the rancher was faster. Colt roared once, and Carter fell, dead before he hit the floorboards. Aftermath. The saloon was silent, save for the ragged breathing of men and women who had nearly lost themselves to fear. The rancher holstered his gun and looked at them one by one. You hand me over, he said, voice low but steady. Crane, don't stop. He'll ride through this town, burn it to ash, and hang the lot of you. That's who he is. That's who he's always been. You want to live, then you stand with me, or you die on your knees. No one spoke against him after that. Crane's wrath, but Carter's betrayal hadn't been for nothing. Crane had gotten what he wanted: knowledge of the town's defenses. Very next night, the riders struck again. Fiercer, harder, probing for the weak points Carter had revealed. Red Rock held, but just barely. Fires spread, ammunition ran low, and as the smoke cleared, the rancher knew one thing for certain: the final reckoning was near. Crane would not wait much longer. The desert dawn rose red, like blood spilling across the horizon. The townsfolk of Red Rock gathered behind their barricades, their faces haggard but resolute. They had survived the siege, endured betrayal, and buried their dead. Now only one truth remained: Crane was coming. The rancher stood at the edge of Main Street, his Colt strapped to his thigh, his rifle slung across his back. He looked over the town at Mary, who carried a rifle with her chin held high, at Sheriff Dillard, whose limp didn't stop him from pacing the barricade, at children crouched behind windows, clutching their mothers' skirts. The town wasn't just defending wood and stone anymore, they were defending each other, and that gave them a kind of strength Crane's gang would never understand. The calm before the storm. For a brief moment, silence ruled the desert. No wind, no bird calls, just the dry breath of anticipation. Then hooves, dozens of them. The sound grew louder, rolling like thunder. Crane's riders emerged from the haze, black silhouettes against the rising sun. Dust trailed their approach, and in the center rode Crane himself, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a long black coat that snapped in the wind like a vulture's wings. He raised a hand, and the riders slowed to a trot. He wanted the rancher to see him, to know this was no raid, no ambush. This was reckoning. Crane's voice carried across the sand, deep and cold. Red Rock. Hand him over, and I'll let the rest of you live. Keep him, and you'll all burn. The rancher stepped forward, rifle in hand. You burned enough already. Crane, he called back. This ends here. Today, between you and me. Crane laughed, sharp and cruel. You think you can end me? Boy, I taught you everything you know. You're a shadow with a borrowed gun. Maybe so, the rancher said. But shadows grow long before night falls. The riders charged. Crane's smile vanished. He dropped his hand. The riders surged forward in a wave of fury, guns blazing, hooves pounding the earth like drums of war. Bullets whistled through the morning air. The rancher fired first. His rifle cracked, and one rider toppled from the saddle. Then the town erupted. Gunfire from windows, from rooftops, from behind wagons. Men and women fought side by side. Every bullet a prayer for survival. The street filled with chaos, horses rearing, men screaming, gunsmoke so thick it choked the breath. The barricades splintered under the onslaught, but Red Rock held. For every townsman who fell, 2 of Crane's riders hit the dust. Crane in the fray through the smoke. Crane cut a path like a demon. His revolvers spat fire, his horse charging straight down Main Street. He rode like he owned the earth beneath him, like death itself answered to his command. The rancher dropped his rifle and drew his Colt, their eyes locked across the chaos. Teacher and student, master and betrayer, blood tied by the past, severed by vengeance. The duel was inevitable, a town on the edge as Crane thundered closer. The rancher ducked behind the wreck of a wagon. Bullets splintered wood inches from his head. Mary shouted his name, firing from the church steps, covering his flank. Sheriff Dillard's shotgun roared from the balcony of the saloon. But Crane's men were too many, and Red Rock was cracking. Under the strain, a barricade on the north side collapsed, and riders poured in. Scattering townsfolk, screams filled the air as fire licked at rooftops. The rancher knew they couldn't hold forever. Red Rock's fate came down to one truth. Crane had to die. The reckoning approaches. The rancher stepped into the open, dust and blood streaking his face. He squared his shoulders, fingers twitching at the Colt on his hip. Crane reined in his horse, just yards away. He dismounted, his boots crunching against the gravel. The street cleared, the battle slowing as if every soul knew what was about to happen. Teacher versus student. The man who made him against the man who had come to end him. Crane smirked, adjusting his black hat. "You sure you're ready, boy?" The rancher's voice was steady. "I've been ready since the day you killed my father." The world held its breath. The duel for Red Rock was about to begin. The world narrowed to a strip of dusty street. 2 men standing 10 paces apart, and a town holding its breath. The morning sun burned overhead, casting long shadows across Red Rock. The gunsmoke still lingered, curling in lazy, ghost-like patterns. But for now, the noise had stilled. Men from both sides crouched behind cover, staring out at the showdown. It was no longer a battle between gangs and townsfolk. It was a reckoning between 2 men bound by blood and betrayal. Crane's black coat flapped in the breeze, his hat low over his eyes. His revolver gleamed at his hip, silver catching the sun. He looked like death, made flesh confident, untouchable. The rancher stood opposite him, boots rooted in the dirt. His chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, hand hovering near his Colt. He wasn't a boy anymore. He wasn't the wide-eyed apprentice who had once admired Crane. He was a man carved by loss, sharpened by rage, and steadied by the people behind him. Words before bullets. Crane's voice carried down the street, gravel and venom. "You think you're different from me, boy. You're not. Same eyes, same fire. The only reason you've lived this long is because I made you. Without me, you'd still be feeding pigs on some worthless ranch." The rancher's jaw tightened. "You're right. You made me. You taught me how to shoot, how to ride, how to fight. But you forgot the most important lesson." Crane tilted his head, amused. "And what's that?" "That a man chooses who he becomes." Crane chuckled, dark and low. "Then choose your grave." The silence stretched. Even the horses seemed to sense it, pawing nervously at the earth. Then fingers twitched. Guns flashed. The crack of revolvers shattered the air, echoing off the buildings like thunder. The rancher dove sideways, rolling into the dirt, his Colt barking twice. Crane spun with serpent speed, his shot grazing the rancher's sleeve. Sparks flew as a bullet struck the metal pump of the well. They circled, firing, reloading, ducking behind barrels and broken wagons. The duel wasn't clean, it was survival. Dust exploded with each near miss, and the air filled again with the stench of black powder. But the rancher fought with something Crane had lost years ago: purpose. Every shot he fired carried not just skill but conviction, justice for his father, for Red Rock, for every soul Crane had bled dry. The turning point. Crane, furious, lunged forward, closing the distance. He fired point blank, the rancher barely twisting aside. The bullet grazed his ribs, hot pain ripping through his side. The rancher staggered, falling to one knee. Crane's grin widened. He smelled victory. "This is it, boy," Crane hissed, striding forward, revolver raised. "Your story ends where mine began." But even as blood trickled from his wound, the rancher steadied his hand. His father's voice echoed in his memory, calm and sure. "Stand tall. Aim true." The rancher rose, lightning in his veins. His Colt roared. The bullet struck. True. Crane reeled back, shock flashing across his face as crimson bloomed across his chest. The end of Crane. He stumbled, dropping his revolver, clutching the wound. His knees hit the dirt, dust swirling around him. He looked up at the rancher with disbelief, as if the idea of his own death was unthinkable. "You were supposed to be me," Crane rasped, voice breaking. The rancher holstered his Colt, stepping closer. "No, I was supposed to end you." Crane's eyes went glassy. His body slumped forward, lifeless, into the dirt of Red Rock. For a long moment, silence ruled. Then the cries rose: cheers, sobs, shouts of victory. Crane's gang, seeing their leader fallen, dropped their weapons. Some fled into the desert, others surrendered, broken. Red Rock rises. The townsfolk rushed into the street, gathering around the rancher. Mary pushed through the crowd, relief and pride shining in her eyes. She caught his arm, steadying him as the blood from his side seeped through his shirt. "You did it," she whispered. "No," he said, voice rough but steady. "We did it." Sheriff Dillard limped over, nodding with respect. "Town owes you a debt it can't repay. But maybe now, we can live free again." The rancher looked at the people around him, faces tired but unbroken. Children peeking out from behind their mothers, men clasping each other's shoulders in hard-won relief. For the first time in years, Red Rock felt alive. A new dawn as the sun climbed higher. Its light touched the rooftops, painting the town in gold. The rancher stood tall, despite his wound, watching as Crane's body was dragged away and the people began to rebuild. He wasn't just a man with a gun anymore. He was a protector, a symbol of what one man could stand for when he chose justice over vengeance. The rancher turned to his horse, stroking its mane. "Looks like we've still got work to do," he murmured. And with the cheers of Red Rock rising behind him, he mounted up, riding into a horizon that no longer felt like a graveyard, but a promise. The past was buried in the dust. The future was his to build with horse and gun, yes, but also with heart and will. The rancher had settled the score.